We'll talk about the features of natural resources. We'll get into the different forms of commodities. And we'll, of course, talk about the risk, return, and diversification benefits. So what are natural resources? Commodities, farmland, timberland. And commodities can be classified into hard, which are mined, and soft, which are grown. Or if you don't like to use the term grown for livestock, you can use fattened. Right? But anything that is biologically grown and harvested and fattened, such as grains and livestock, crops, is soft, whereas anything that you're mining is going to be hard. That includes oil, by the way, because you might think that anything hard, which is metals, is going to be only hard commodities, but gas and oil are also mined or extracted, and they fall under hard commodities. Next is farmland. So we talked about commodities. Now we're talking about farmland. And this is, of course, linked to soft commodities because that's where many soft commodities come from. They are either grown or fattened, and you need farmland for that. Right? And the farmland then earns money by selling these crops or that livestock. They can also lease the land to the farmers, and then the farmers can do it and pay you a lease for it. You can also talk about timberland. So here there's going to be sale of trees, right? Or you can add value and create furniture or other timber products. So what is the history of this? And I'll talk about this last paragraph in a minute. Let me just talk about the history first, because this last paragraph is a little bit of a confusing area. So we'll just talk about it shortly. Let's focus on the history first. So up until 20 years ago, what would happen is that you would buy stocks and bonds of companies that were in this business, right? And if you relate it to our discussion on real estate, that is something we spoke about in terms of indirect investing, where we said that you can invest in a company that does real estate investments, management, real estate development, and if you buy the shares of that company, that would be an indirect investment. Now, what has become possible is direct investments, right? Which means corporations can directly buy the physical land and get into management of it. However, now this last paragraph can get confusing because it says nowadays, however, due to the wide variety of direct investments available, ETFs, REITs, well, these are not direct investments. These are indirect investments, right? And when we talked about indirect investments earlier, in addition to buying shares of the companies, we said you can do it through ETFs and funds, etc., and real estate investment trusts, right? Investors typically participate now in these assets directly. So this don't get confused by this. The point is that now more and more investors are getting into more of an active role within these asset classes instead of just buying the shares of companies that were in agricultural business. They are now using innovative ways to get more exposure. So that's the point over here. Please don't get confused by the use of the word direct for things like ETF. Keep that concept very clear in your mind, that direct means actual physical ownership, right? And indirect means either through shares of a corporation, right, or ETF or fund, etc. Now, we will talk about the characteristics of all of this stuff, right, which includes the three types of lands: raw, or used for growing trees, or used for growing crops, We'll talk about the different commodities that come from those either farmland or other sources like your rigs, oil rigs, etc. And we'll then bring it all together and say how do they contribute to risk, return, and diversification. So let's get started with the features, with the first one being timberland. Now, the basic concept I want you to understand with respect to timberland and farmland is that farmland is used to grow crops or livestock, and then once that crops or livestock is ready, then it has to be sold because it becomes ripe or old enough, right? And then it has to be sold. Because if you don't sell it, it will either die if it's livestock, or it will get, it'll just get spoiled. It'll expire. So that problem is not there. Here you can say, maybe you can think of it in terms of a longer life, right, product or asset that you don't, in the farmland space, you don't really get to decide when to sell. Here, in the timberland space, you get to decide when to sell. You are in the decision seat, and when the price is high, that's when you can sell, right? And when the price is low, nobody can force you to cut the trees and sell them. So it's a very interesting asset class because you can think of it as a store of value, right? You can think of this as a store of value that I've got this investment, and whenever I want, I can sell a bit of it, right? If the prices are high, and when the prices are not high, you don't sell. So this is a distinguishing feature of timberland. And in terms of the return, right, this is going to be there in raw land as well. This is going to be there in farmland as well, which is your underlying land price going up, right? But this is unique to timberland because with farmland, you cannot decide when to sell. When the crop is ready, when the livestock is ready, well, you have to sell regardless whether the price is high or low. In the case of timberland, you can play around with the prices. And in the case of timberland, you have biological growth, which is not there in your farmland and your livestock, because that is the core process of production, that whatever your crop is, that is the yield. It's not like your base increases, right? Here, the base is also increasing. You'll get newer trees, which can give you wood. I know that concept is a bit difficult to understand because, of course, in livestock also there is biological growth, and in farmland there is biological growth as well. But what I want you to think of is that, think of it in terms of yield, right? So the timberland is also giving you yield. Timberland is also giving you yield, which is from the existing trees, but then it is also giving you growth, which those two are not giving, the crops and livestock. So timberland has two things extra, which is biological growth and change in prices. You can play around with the prices as well. This is common for all three, raw land, farmland, and timberland. The underlying price change of the land price going up, that's common. Right. Of course, it's a very good investment when it comes to the environment because it consumes carbon, takes in carbon dioxide and gives out oxygen. So that's, of course, very, very good. Farmland, hedge against inflation, just like your timberland. A lot of common points over here, right? You can grow crops, you can have it for livestock, but the main distinguishing point over here is that it does not provide that production flexibility because they have to be harvested. These farm products have to be harvested when they are ripe, right? So you get the land appreciation, you get the sale of the commodity, and that you'd get in the tree sales as well, right? So even you can harvest the trees and sell them. So this is there in timberland, this is there in timberland, this is there in timberland, but timberland also has biological growth which is not there in farmland, right? So biological growth and prices changing angle. So these two are missing in your farmland, because in farmland you cannot choose the prices at which to sell. So these two are missing. This, of course, is also considered a sustainable investment. Land investments versus real estate. Now, what did we talk about in real estate? A lot of similarities, unique, illiquid, right? What are the differences? Well, when we talked about real estate, we talked about developing that real estate. Here, we're not really concerned with making buildings on top of our farmland. We're more interested with the climate around that farmland and the soil of that farmland. The location is very important, especially when it comes to transport. And think of the value to volume ratio. Think of things like onions, tomatoes. I mean, they take up a lot of volume, but the value is not that much. I mean, of course, they're very valuable, but think of commodities versus gold, right? How much gold you can have in one 20-foot container versus how much tomatoes you can have in a 20-foot container, and what would be the difference in the value. So because these are expensive when it comes to transportation, because they take up a lot of space and they're not that valuable compared to other things like gold. So what happens is, if they are far from a transportation hub, that transportation expense as a percentage of the value, it becomes a lot. That's why the location of the land is very important. Now, is it easy to directly physically get invested in these things? The answer is no. It requires specialized knowledge and understanding, right? And that's where TIMOs come in. Timberland Investment Management Organizations, and these are, of course, exclusive for timberland, right? So farmland doesn't have this, but the timberlands, in addition to the ETFs and the funds, which farmland will also have, and timberland will also have, but timberland has this special type of investment mechanism, which is TIMOs. And this brings us to this very nice exhibit from your curriculum. So let's get into it. And let me just make the... Right, so return drivers. First of all, raw land, you can only get the return from the price of the land changing, right? However, with farmland, you can sell the crops or the livestock, right? And higher prices obviously means higher return, and the price of land can go up as well. Now that is there in timberland as well. But here you get to play with that additional lumber price part, right? Which you can't really play with in the commodities. And also you have that angle of biological growth, right? It keeps increasing in the number of trees. Source of direct revenue, price appreciation, lease revenue, which means you can lease the land out. You can lease the land out in all three cases, right? The price appreciation is there in all three cases, right? The sale of crops and trees is common for all of these. The value comes from obviously the physical location in all three, right? Growth cycle and soil quality for farmland, and quality of timber. So for example, Burma teak, or it's very famous, or in Malaysia you have this very nice Malaysian, I believe it's also called teak. So depends on the quality of the wood and also the phase of the production. Now what does that mean? So how much value addition is being done on that timberland? Are you just like selling the timber, or are you actually adding value and then selling furniture maybe, right? So you could even add value and have advanced stages of timber production. So the quality of the timber, and then of course the phase of production, that determines the value. The main risks, best alternative use, so obviously it depends on where your raw land is, and if it is having a lot of alternatives, that's good. If it doesn't have any alternatives, it's in the middle of nowhere, well, that's not going to be worth very much. For farmland and timberland, the risks are weather. That's a serious problem. Biological factors, diseases. This could lead to some big issues. And this is more important with the physical ownership, right? It's actually one of the disadvantages of physical ownership, that you're exposing yourself to this risk. Who are the owners? Now, of course, this is not a hard fact. This is from an American perspective, that mostly institutional, but in many parts of the world, there's a lot of individuals who are into law land and timberland ownership. But from the CFA Institute perspective, why are we saying mostly individuals for farmland versus mostly institutional for timberland? So the logic is that timberland is much bigger in terms of acres of ownership, right? Versus farmland is relatively smaller. So individuals can still own farmland much easier, in a much easier manner versus timberland. Timberland is usually institutional. So from an exam perspective, what you need to remember is timberland is mostly institutional because it's larger in scale, and farmland can be individual as well. In terms of ownership, you can have direct and in partnerships. You bring in the REITs for your farmland, and you bring in the TMOs for your timberland as well. Right. So this is what I was saying, right? Timberland are typically thousands more of acres, and therefore they are more suited for institutional, whereas your farmland is relatively smaller and can therefore be suitable for family ownership. Now, that doesn't mean institutions cannot own farmland. Rather, the curriculum here is making the case for institutionals to physically own farmland, and why. So instead of getting exposure through futures contracts to crops, if you directly go for farmland, what happens is that you get into a broader universe, right? Because futures contracts are not there for all crops. They're there for the main crops, but in terms of physical, then you can get a much broader exposure. But that doesn't come without disadvantages. So obviously what happens is that you might not know what you're doing. So you need specialists, right? And of course, even if, let's say, you do really well and something really works out for you, but you're not able to cash it in because these investments are illiquid, and you might need to negotiate with somebody to take it off your hands, and they might not want to pay you a premium. So they are illiquid. It's not as easy to get in and get out of as futures contracts are. And of course, weather can change, and that could really drastically reduce your yield, and even worse things can happen. So this is a dangerous exposure to have. Okay, let's take a break, and then we'll come back and get into commodities.